Uh-oh, bird flu's here in Missouri, in my county. It's been detected. What am I gonna do about it? Let's talk about it. Hey guys, welcome back to another slightly rednecked video. Again, my name's Chris. If you're not familiar with this channel, I help you to produce your own meat, eggs, and vegetables from your backyard, your balcony, deck, or garage, or even a spare room in your house if that's the way you want to do it. Like I said in the intro, the bird flu has been detected in Jasper County, southwest Missouri. That's the county I live in. But I'm not really all that worried about it when it comes to my birds, and I'm going to tell you a little bit why. Let's start off by talking about what is the bird flu. If you're not familiar with the bird flu, it is, well, it's just like what it sounds like. It's avian influenza, the same kind of thing that, as humans we get the flu, birds can get it as well. Now the problem with the bird flu is that it is highly contagious. It's a virus, but it can be transmitted very easily amongst birds. And it really affects your chicken, your quail, or your turkeys, those kinds of backyard poultry that people would keep. It can affect any of your birds though. It's most commonly carried by waterfowl, so geese, ducks, those are the primary carriers of it. They're not as affected by it. They typically don't show symptoms of having the flu, but they do carry the virus with them. So that's most commonly how it's transmitted, and that's why I'm not terribly worried about it right now. So there's a few things that you can do to make sure that you don't have to worry about the bird flu either. First of all, again, it is carried primarily by waterfowl, but it can be carried by any kind of wild bird. So if you have your quail in hutches like this, or in a building, in a shed, a garage, something like that, you're probably not going to have to worry about it too much because the wild birds can't get to your quail. So that's one preventative measure that you want to keep them away from, especially from the food and from the water. If the wild birds have access to your quail's food and water, that's a big concern and a big way that this virus is transmitted from one bird to another, is through either contact with water sources that have been contaminated or food sources that have been contaminated, mostly from wild birds being able to get to your quail's food and water. So my quails are caged up. No wild birds can have access to this. None of them can get in and get access to their food or their water. Another thing I'm not worried about is I've got roofs over the top of my quail hutches. So if I do have wild birds, like waterfowl that are migrating right now, that tend to fly over the property, I'm not going to have to worry about the droppings hitting the quail because the roof protects them from that kind of thing. So that's another preventative measure that you can put in place, is make sure that whatever you have your quail in, it has a cover over the top of it, prevents droppings from wild birds being able to enter your quail's space. That's very important. Now I could have wild birds that would land on top here, but since it's all wire mesh, typically those droppings, if they do have any, are going to fall through. It is a slight risk. I'm not terribly worried about it. It's unlikely. I mean, it's not unlikely necessarily that I would have a small wild bird, finches and those kinds of things that would fly up here and maybe land on this. That could happen. It doesn't typically. I haven't noticed any birds congregating up here, but it could happen. But it's unlikely that I'm going to have a wild goose or duck or anything like that, waterfowl, get up on top of this cage in between the roof and the cage itself. Very unlikely that that's going to happen. If it does, then that would be an area of concern, of course. The other thing that you can do to prevent having any issues with avian influenza in your flock is to keep them raised off the ground. If they're in contact with the ground, especially if other animals, other wild birds have access to that ground as well, it's going to be a much higher risk of transmitting the illness. Now the influenza, the virus that causes avian influenza, can live on surfaces for several weeks. I've heard, up to a month. It can live on a surface and be transmitted from one bird to another. So that's another area that you want to make sure that you have preventative measures in, especially if you've been visiting any kind of water source, public water source, ponds, rivers, lakes. Rivers I would think would be probably, not as likely to be able to transmit it. But if you're going to a local park that has a waterway and you're in contact with that, it's almost a guarantee that you're going to have wild waterfowl that are going to stop by that watering place from time to time, and they could very easily be carrying the avian influenza with them and transmitting it through the water. If you're in contact with that, you want to make sure that you disinfect your clothing before you interact with your birds, because you can easily carry that from a wild, from a waterway somewhere that you visited feeding the ducks or geese or you know, taking care, whatever you're doing there, you can easily transmit it from that to your birds. Now there are a couple things you want to look out for if you're concerned about your birds getting avian influenza. First of all, quail are incredibly susceptible to it. If they catch it, it's a bad thing, and it can move through your covey very, very quickly because it's highly, highly contagious. So you do want to keep an eye on your birds. If you start noticing some odd behavior, what you're going to look for is things like you know, respiratory type issues with your birds. So that would be like wheezing or coughing, maybe some discharge from their nasal cavities. You're probably not going to notice that much. But lethargic birds that don't move around much or act wobbly, confused, you know, don't have coordination very well. If you start noticing that in your flock, your best bet is to isolate those birds, probably cull them immediately, get them away from the rest of your flock and dispose of them, and then do a thorough cage cleaning just to be preventative, just to keep it from happening. Other things you might look for too is if you start having sudden death in your flock. Now I'm not talking about just losing one bird out of a group of like 20 birds. That's going to happen from time to time, and it's nothing to panic about. But if you start losing, if you see 2 or 3 birds all of a sudden just suddenly died, and you have another bird or two that may be kind of acting kind of weird, not right, that would be a concern that you might have an outbreak of avian influenza. You can get it tested. You can go to a local, call your local agricultural department, your MPIP department, whatever it is in your area. They could come in and test your birds and see if you have avian influenza there or not. Or you can just try to minimize that problem, isolate those birds, get them away from the rest of your covey, cull them and dispose of them properly so you don't have to worry about it spreading. And again, sanitation is the key here. You want to make sure that you're not bringing, if you visited somebody else's chickens, if you visited, like I said, a local waterway, a pond, a river, you know, where other wild birds have access to, you want to disinfect yourself before you interact with them. So that would mean change your clothes, disinfect your shoes, wipe them down with some bleach water or something like that. Take a shower. Do all those things before you interact with your birds, because you don't want to carry that into your covey. If you bring it in and one bird gets sick, that's highly likely it's going to wipe out your entire covey. And that brings me to the last point why I'm not terribly worried about it. You know, if worst comes to worst and I lose my entire covey of quail, all of them, it's not that big a deal to order eggs in, build it back up. I'm a pretty small operation, so it's not a huge concern for me. And for most people out there that are probably watching these videos, you're probably running a pretty small operation too. 1 or 2 hutches like me. It's pretty easy to restock those, order some eggs in, restock them if you need to. It's not a huge concern if I, like I said, were to lose everything. It's a pretty small investment just to get stocked right back up. But that's the way I look at it, and I'm not going to be too concerned about it. All right, so again, the big reason that avian influenza is a big issue right now is because of the migratory birds. This is the time of year when they are migrating and they're flying in from other places. They're carrying that in from Canada, from, you know, wherever, down, probably going south to north, I think, you know, is the way they're going now. So maybe from Mexico or wherever it is, from the southern to the northern, they're carrying it with them as they're migrating from one spot to another. So if you do have areas on your property, maybe a pond or something like that, where you have wild birds that are, you know, especially waterfowl that are stopping by from time to time, it's going to be a bigger concern for you than it is for the rest of us. I don't have that on my property. We do have wild waterfowl that will fly over from time to time, but they don't tend to stop right here. I've never seen one. I live in town, so I've never seen one in my area. Now, we do have local parks that have ponds in them, and birds and wild waterfowl will stop in those parks. I don't typically visit those, but if I were to, I would make sure to disinfect myself and my clothing before I interacted with my birds. But other than that, it's not a huge concern. It's not something that I'm really worried about my birds catching, because the risk is pretty low where I live and the way I keep my birds. So anyway, hopefully this has helped put your mind at ease if this was something that you were concerned about. You know, one of the big things I think that would be recommended is to not bring, you know, if you have strangers coming over or people coming over, don't let them interact with your flock without being cleaned up. It's probably best practice just to not let them interact with your flock, you know, your birds at all, especially if they are poultry keepers, if they've been to local poultry swaps, if they've been to local, and you just don't know. If they've been to a local waterway or any of those kinds of things that we talked about, you just don't know. So it's probably best to keep them away from your birds, not let them handle your birds. They could be carrying it on them. If you have other people that, backyard chickens, you're best not to interact with their flock and then come and interact with yours without first disinfecting yourself, cleaning yourself up, changing your clothes, all those good kinds of things, so you don't have to worry about carrying something in. It's also a good time or a good practice right now to make sure that you are upping your sanitation, or your cleanliness, I should say. Make sure that you're cleaning up the manure from your birds. Don't let it just sit around. Try to keep it cleaned up, maybe a little bit more stringent on that than you would normally be if you're only emptying their trays or cleaning out their sandboxes, once every month. You might want to bump that up to at least once or twice a week, just to do a little bit of extra precautions to keep that from happening. But then again, like I said, hopefully this puts your mind at ease. It's probably not something you're going to have to worry about too much. If you are concerned, if you are worried that maybe your birds have avian influenza, if you're seeing symptoms of it, like I said, the sneezing, the coughing, the wheezing, general lethargic birds, birds that are just suddenly dying for no explained reason, multiple birds that are dying for no explained reason, or birds that are acting, uncoordinated, wobbling around like they're drunk or something like that. If you notice those kinds of symptoms, get them away from the rest of your birds, clean the cage, disinfect everything, hope for the best there. If you're really concerned, you can get it tested and find out if you've got it or not. And again, I'm just resting on the fact that if I do happen to lose all of my birds, I can always order some eggs, replace them pretty quickly. That is the great thing about quail, is that they are very fast to get back up to big numbers if you need to. So anyway, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully this put your mind at ease if this was something you were worried about. I think I've said that 3 or 4 times, but hopefully it does help. Thank you for watching. As always, God bless.